Alliance, but the Asian Australian Alliance Women's Forum, the Asian Australian Rainbow Alliance, the Asian Australian Alliance for Youth, the Movement for Asian Australian Academics. And each of them have their own projects, and we have branches also in most of the states, very active in New South Wales and Victoria. You may have seen us in the media with the current campaign recently, and if you find our work interesting or would like to contribute, please follow us on our Facebook page, or you can contact us directly on the email provided on the page as well. So that's for the introduction, and I'll hand it back to Thompson. Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Melina. And now I would like to call upon Erin to provide a little bit more information about the project that the Asian Australian Alliance are undertaking.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending today. We have a really good turnout. So we hopefully the report, will be fruitful in terms of providing data and some results. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. That doesn't matter where we are around the world. And I just want to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and I'm just going to be very quickly in terms of going over that, over the results. So just give me a second. Let me share. Okay, so let me just share. Thompson, can you disable the screen sharing? If not, I can just go over the results. So yeah, so it's, yeah, okay, so I'll just try it now. Yeah, you gotta disable the screen so I can enable it, I mean. So
yeah,
as soon as he then I can share. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. It works now. Just give me a second. So just let us know he can't see my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to. Okay, cool. So basically, I'm just going to give a very quick overview. I don't want to take too much time because we want to give a lot more time to, for people to provide questions, and us kind of answering the questions. But this incident report survey is basically a collaboration between us at the Asian Australian Alliance and Osmond Chiu, a research fellow at the Capita think tank. And as Thompson mentioned, our two partners, Democracy in Colour and Diversity Arts Australia. So I want to share two de-identified stories, and these are actual experiences that people actually recorded in our survey. So you can see this first one is from a female in Sydney, and she was told to stay away from them because she's Asian, and he said, so I have coronavirus. Told her it was my people who brought the virus over here, attempted to kick me, called me an Asian slut and an Asian dog, told me to go eat a bat, threatened me with a knife, spat in my face, and she actually got spit in her left eye. That's one of the many stories that we received. This is another one from a male in the ACT. And this is from somebody that he knew, a colleague who I did not meet before, asked if I knew what COVID was. I said, yes, it's a virus. And then he jokingly asked if I knew what CCP was. I said, I don't know. Then I was told I'm Chinese. I should know, as it stood for Chinese Communist Party. I replied, what is it got to do with me, as I mix Indian, Chinese, and now Australian? So from some of these stories, what we can tell is that, yes, majority of them are stranger, this type of racism, but there are instances where the people know the actual people who are being racist, and those who are acquainted with the people are generally the type of racism that in many ways. So I'm going to gloss very quickly over the results because you guys can access the report on our website. But over 65% of the respondents identified as female. So I don't think this statistic is surprising, but it also shows that females of an Asian background were the primary targets, during this COVID-19 pandemic racism. in terms of the states and where where it was recorded the most, New South Wales and Victoria. So New South Wales first and Victoria second, you know, were the highest, you know, 37%, and the from there. So I think the next is WA, South Australia, T. And here are just 2 points on the type of racism. So the most common type is 35% were the form of racial slurs or name calling. And if we add together the percentages or the amounts of, you know, physical and verbal harassment, so that includes racial slurs, physical intimidation, verbal threats, it would amount to almost 60%. So you can see that these are the types of you know, incidents that people are experiencing. And 40% of the COVID-19 related racism happened on a public street sidewalk. So when people are just doing their day-to-day things, and 22% of incidents happened in a supermarket. And a lot of those cases included incidents where people were accused of hoarding, you know, either toilet paper or other kind of necessity items. And then 9.4% of the incidents happened online. And so this is just a chart that shows where it is happening online, and you can, and surprise, surprise, Facebook is the majority at around 43.7%, and usually came in the form of messages or comments and things like that. So I'm not surprised that's from Facebook, but it shows that online is also a major issue. And just some other stats that you guys can read. I don't want to go through all of them, but just like I said, more than 84% of perpetrators were unknown. So a lot of them were mostly stranger. Over 90% of respondents did not report their incident to the police. And, you know, there are some reasons that we will discuss later on about as to why. And 15% of respondents identified themselves as international students, of whom 80% stated that they were from China. So I don't think these statistics are actually quite surprising, but they just back up things, you know, beyond the anecdotal evidence of racism. And you can actually now access our report on the AsianAustralianAlliance.net website, and you go to the COVID-19 section, you can actually download the report. So I'll hand it back to Thompson, and I'll stop sharing. That's my part for now.
Thank you, Erin. And for the next, I would like to call upon Osmond Chiu to provide an analysis of the survey.
Yeah, thanks, Thompson. So I'd firstly like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So Erin went through some of the results from our survey. The results are for the first 2 months of the survey. So we have a few more reports after that. But I think based on those results, there are a few clear trends that we can identify. So based on the various stories that we've heard, it's quite clear that Chinese and Asian are being used quite interchangeably by perpetrators. And I think that emphasizes the importance of having solidarity, because people are really just being reduced to their racial appearance. The fact that a clear majority of respondents identified as female and the perpetrators were unknown to those who reported the incidents suggests that there are power dynamics at play, and we shouldn't forget that. And it seems that women are seen as easier targets by those perpetrators. Now, the random and opportunistic nature of many of these incidents is emphasized by the fact that they're primarily taking place in a public space, such as a sidewalk or in a supermarket. So if there is a level of premeditation, people are being targeted simply on the basis of race. And I think that really highlights that there really is something driving this. And I think COVID-19 has really brought it to the surface, but clearly something has existed previously, and I think that really needs to be delved into far more. So from the various incidents that were reported, there were really some common themes. So for example, references to eating habits, especially bats, Asians being the carrier of diseases, and hoarding. And that kind of sort of echoes some of the historic anti-Chinese narratives that we've seen in the West since really the 19th century. But also a number of people have mentioned references to the government of the People's Republic of China and also the Chinese Communist Party. And I think just these various themes and narratives suggest that there is some commonality, and I think flags that there has been a role that the media and also social media has played in spreading these specific messages that people have absorbed. While there's really been a lot of focus on violent attacks when there's been discussion about anti-Asian racism, I think that it's, in a way, it's been used to emphasize how rare it's been. And I think that's been a bit of a distraction. I think as these results show, these racist incidents have primarily taken the forms of, abuse, physical intimidation, being spat on, and which highlights how widespread it is if you look at the full range. And I think we also shouldn't overlook those other points that Erin flagged. So, for example, those casual jokes in workplace context, as well as some of the racist abuse and slurs over social media, Facebook in particular. And I wanted to conclude my comments on the issue of reporting, because I think that's where a lot of the focus has been. So for a variety of reasons, people are not reporting these incidents. While for our survey, we did not ask why, I think there's a few possible explanations. So I think a lack of knowledge as to how to report and who to. So whether you should report to police, the Australian Human Rights Commission, relevant state bodies. Also a belief that the process is too much hassle and you're not really sure about what will happen at the end. Other beliefs that racism, like particularly non-violent forms of racism, are just what happens in Australia and it's not serious because it didn't involve physical violence. And also potentially distrust of authorities or concern it might impact on other things. So for example, the visa status of international students. I guess one of the problems caused by this lack of reporting means that it's not considered as much of a problem because there is limited data, and it may result in less focus and less resources being provided to combat this racism. So really, it's almost like a vicious cycle. I think we do want to acknowledge that there have been responses by governments and government agencies to the work we've been doing publicising these incidents. But most of these responses have been targeted at awareness raising about processes. So, creating multilingual resources, which I think is important, but less so at addressing some of these other reasons and delving into why this anti-Asian racism is occurring. So for example, there's still no funding of a national anti-racism strategy. And where prosecutions have happened for incidents, they've not really used race hate or racial vilification laws. So I think these are some areas where far more work needs to be done.
Okay. Thanks, Osmond, on that. I think that really give a little bit more insights into how this survey is being done and also the analysis. We might just there's a couple of questions that I think is quite interesting, and I just wanted to bring that in. And this is, I think, more directed towards Osmond, and this is in relations to the survey itself, and this is from Julie Nathan. In order to be more understanding towards the situation more clearly, would there be a supplementary report listing all the anti-Asian racist incidents?
I mean, we are planning on continuing with the survey into the future, and of course, this report only covers the first 2 months of data we've collected. So I guess one of the challenges is because people have provided this information to us in confidence, we've tried to aggregate data and de-identify wherever we can. I think we're aware that, you know, this is not an academic study, but this merely provides a snapshot of what has been going on. So we won't capture everything, but we are hoping to, you know, continue with the survey and release more data and findings in the future, depending on community engagements.
Okay. Now, I just wanted to bring back Molina over here, because obviously we have done the reporting and we've done some analysis, but what about recommendation? And I know that there are a couple of questions that is being sent over to us via email in relation to that. So Molina, can I get you into this part to provide the recommendations on the survey?
Yes, thanks, Thompson. So the findings of our report have informed our recommendations, and Osmond's already spoken about some of the issues that we have seen arising from the report, which is the barriers that people face in reporting and for getting adequate redress, and also the media rhetoric around this issue. So our recommendations therefore seek action at all levels. So beginning with recommendations for government action, we recommend that the Commonwealth government should spearhead a new and national anti-racism strategy to improve community understanding of what constitutes racism, why it is a problem and ways to prevent it and reduce its prevalence, and education about avenues to report. I saw some questions coming up asking about who they should report to and what the legalities are. And I think that's something that's unclear to a lot of people. Again, the police and the relevant state anti-discrimination bodies and the Australian Human Rights Commission should work together to improve data collection on racially motivated incidents and enable nationally consistent data on incidents of racism. This should be coupled with better cultural sensitivity training for police and greater investment in multicultural and community liaison work. We also recommend the creation of a one-stop shop to simplify the process of reporting for those who have experienced racism, as well as the creation of a simple multilingual reporting avenue to facilitate reporting of incidents for those for whom English is not a first language. Services should not just be mere translations from English, but adapted and contextualized to the various scaled community needs. This may involve the creation of specific language offices, which can be the bridge for these communities and accessing government services in general. Then removal of legislative barriers to prosecution for racially motivated criminal actions and the strengthening of the anti-vilification laws. This is already in train in Victoria, and we are part of that campaign to strengthen the anti-vilification laws in Victoria. In terms of the media, we recommend that the Australian Human Rights Commission should work with organizations such as the Australian Press Council to develop advisory guidelines for removing unconscious bias in reporting on Asia and Asian Australian communities. This will assist newsrooms and media professionals in understanding how such bias can inadvertently flame anti-Asian sentiments and the reasons why. Social media platforms should make it easier to report and remove trending content that is confirmed as false that may encourage COVID-19 related anti-Asian racism. Individuals who share removed content should be directly informed by platforms that the content was verified as false. Some of the other recommendations are the strengthening the work on promoting human rights among the temporary residents, including international students. We have seen a lot of issues with the international students coming out recently. Reference to principles to protect the human rights of international laws. Involvement of multicultural community leaders, civil rights organizations, student bodies, and other stakeholders in developing strategies against racial discrimination. This also includes bystander intervention training, which we think is really important. So these are some of our recommendations. We will be working on it further to make it into an action plan. Finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about an upcoming project that we are working on, which is the South Asian project. Racism Against South Asian project. There have been a lot of events reported recently where South Asians have been targeted. And that has also moved into the sphere of political activism, and for people who are standing for elections, they have been racially targeted. So we feel that there's a need to look at the specific issues of the South Asian community and why they're being targeted, and what are the barriers that they face in reporting. So stay tuned for more information on that in the coming weeks. So that's all from me. Thank you. Back to you, Thompson.
Thank you, Melina. So with that, we completed the former presentations and presenting of the survey, and we'll move into Q&A straight away. And we've received a number of questions, both from emails and also from the live chat room. Now, the first questions comes from, and this is in relations to some of things that our speakers have talked about, and this is on social media. So it's from Jess Hangan Fu. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. And it says, I'm a postgraduate student who is currently working on a project to investigate the role of lived experience in hashtag movements in racial justice and racism issues. I'm interested in how social media is used or seen by respondents in the report, or do they see it as a tool to highlight issues, raise awareness, or call to action, etc.?
I can answer that question. As I stated in my presentation, there were around close to 10% of the reports which reported incidents which happened online. And a lot of the stories that we've read in terms of the online abuse, they do obviously involve Facebook. A lot of them are people who either posted something on their own Facebook page, and that could have been something of, activism nature, something about racism and things like that. And then they got, either people they know come back on and racially discriminate them, or post something racist, or they're commenting on news articles and then, getting racism from there. Other people have also reported that they got, racism through messages. So if you are familiar with Facebook, there's a unfiltered section of the messenger part. And a lot of people have, those who did get online abuse, mentioned that they did get quite racist messages, particularly after they commented on some type of, news, mainstream Australian news Facebook page article. A lot of these articles were either about, racism or or articles which flagged an anti-China, anti-Asian type sentiment. So those are where a lot of our reports are coming from in terms of online. In terms of the importance of social media, I think social media, particularly in this environment, current situation now with COVID-19 as well, I think it is important, and it's a way that people can spread awareness and messages and activism through online, and you can actually reach out a bigger audience and a global audience by doing so, but also be mindful of safety, because your own safety and your own comfort zone is also very important. Some people are comfortable with, like myself, who's quite open in terms of talking about these issues, but other people may not be. So you just do what you're most comfortable in. But the more we do voice out, and the more we do talk about these issues, it would always be kept in the mainstream. So I don't know if others want to chime in on that, Osmond, Lena?
Yeah, I mean, I guess with social media, it can go either way. So, for example, a lot of our promotion of this survey and a lot of interest we've created around it has been through social media platforms. But at the same time, there are a number of examples where social media has been used to promote misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So from recollection, there was a BuzzFeed article, I think a month or two ago, just about how social media is being used by far-right groups to essentially organise around, anti-Chinese racism in relation to COVID. And there's also been examples where, someone has posted a claim, the example being that I think it was a warehouse or a shop in Melbourne was hoarding goods to export to China, which was shared over 90,000 times. So police investigated and found that was blatantly false. But the sheer fact that, an unverified claim that would encourage sort of anti-Asian sentiment essentially spread like wildfire on Facebook is extremely concerning. Just because, once it gets out there, your ability to really counteract those false claims is really limited.
Okay. So the next question that I just wanted to bring in here is from Dilnas. And the question is, often people say I'm not racist, but or the excuse of unconscious bias, why are people afraid of calling it out? Now, there's racism within the culture from those who are more educated, wealthy towards those socially and economically disadvantaged. Does the panel agree with this? And how do we tackle this?
Well, I'm happy to go first. I guess one of the challenges is that there's a particular understanding of what racism is. And it's related to specific forms of discrimination, but also hatred, malice, something evil, that it is a moral failing of an individual or an institution. And I think that really shapes people's reaction when you talk about racism or an act being racist or someone being racist, because they think, no, I'm not an evil, monstrous person who hates people from a different cultural or ethnic background, so I can't be a racist. And so in many ways, it results in a situation where people not only get defensive, but the sheer fact of calling it out can be worse than the act itself. So I think that's one thing that needs to be understood. And that, I guess, poses challenges because it means that when you talk to people about these issues, you sometimes have to sort of tiptoe around it, unfortunately, to actually engage with them and actually have this conversation about things like unconscious bias and these systemic issues that exist.
I think a lot of it has to do with fear as well. It's the fear of something that you don't understand, and that manifests itself in various ways, and that's what probably leads to the unconscious bias side of it. It's that not understanding where people are coming from, and that's probably where we need that the work that Dilnas does. I know is that interfaith work, the work with various communities, bringing them together, is what helps in trying to understand where we're coming from, why our culture is the way it is, and how we kind of react to certain things, and that probably that education helps in removing that those biases that we have in our own minds. So that's probably the work that needs to be done more to be able to address this issue.
Okay. The next question is from Nandini Chand. And the question is, as the COVID-19 racism emerges with Australia's heightened war with China rhetoric, what do you think we as community can do to protect our basic rights and interests?
I'm happy to start answering that. And I think one thing that we need to remember is that you can obviously be critical of the Chinese Communist Party and the regime itself, and you can be against racism. I think there is some type of stigma in society, and this could be brought on by, those that, we consider anti-China, particularly anti-China hawks, or what you want to call them. And it's basically that it's either one side or the other. You cannot be both. If you're talking about the racism against Chinese or Asian people in Australia, then you are feeding into the CCP propaganda machine. So one thing we need to understand is that you can actually talk about both, and there's nothing wrong about talking about both. At the same time, when you are being critical of the regime itself and those who are critical, you've got to be extremely mindful of how you discuss this, because China, like any global superpower, be it the US, the UK, or whatever, does the exact same things. They all do the same things as each other, but there seems to be double standards in terms of how the US is discussed, or the growing influence of the US, and how the growing influence of China is discussed. And we see that in the tabloid, particularly the Australian tabloid media and the global tabloid media, in terms of how they push that anti-China and anti-Chinese rhetoric, particularly in how they report about the growing influence of China, but also scapegoating, things that may or may not be true, and making accusations which may or may not be true. So I think one thing we remember is that when you don't be afraid of talking about both. Obviously being critical of any government or regime is extremely important, and it is, our democratic right to do so. But be mindful of, when you do speak about it, the issues of racism. And I think with this whole issue around China, what it has brought about is that it seems that a lot of that racialized rhetoric is not just coming from the hard right or the alt-right, but it's also coming from the progressive left, or those who consider themselves the progressive left. So I know that there are a lot of people who are not like that. And it just seems to be such a mainstream thing and normalized. And the idea of being anti-China or anti-Chinese is no longer, is not considered as being racist, and is actually being quite normalized by people from both sides, of that sphere. So I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that.
I'll have to make one or two comments. I guess, none of us would defend what goes on within China, but I think one of the problems is this sort of comparison between Australia and what goes on in China. The fact that, there is discrimination against, ethnic minorities in China, and somehow that, because it is so much worse, that we shouldn't even discuss it in Australia. And I guess the way I like to think about it is that, discussing issues of racism in Australia do not diminish what happens within the People's Republic of China. I actually think that if we actually believe in, multiculturalism, pluralism, and democratic rights, it's actually important to have these discussions and to push back against racism to show the strength of Australia's democratic character. So I think that's at least how I see it, and why I think that we actually should have these conversations and not be defensive. Because I think the sheer fact that we get defensive means that it is more likely that these issues may be treated as a kind of geopolitical wedge.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is from Tim Habel, and this is a question in relation to the CCTV and supermarkets. So Tim is interested to know if there's been any response from major supermarket groups, given the number of incidents happen within the supermarket, and also given the fact that there's a CCTV installed in supermarkets. And is there anyone who runs, this is the second question, is there anyone who runs racism-specific bystander training?
I can try to answer the first part, and maybe I think Melina can more equipped to answer the second part. So no, we have not been had any engagement or contacted by any of the major supermarket chains, be it Woolies, Coles, or whatever. And I think one thing I did want to point out is that the incidents which people described, which happened at the supermarket, like I said earlier, it was usually them being accused of hoarding. I remember one incident, the lady, and she was a mother, she had a young kid, and her kid was in the, in the trolley, and she had one tin of baby milk formula in there, and she was just about to get a packet of toilet paper. And then she just got yelled at and told that she should not be hoarding and taking stuff back to China. So that's one experience. And from all the experiences that we've read that's happened in a supermarket, the management itself didn't do anything. and a lot of them felt quite traumatized afterwards. So I think that question is a very good question, and it's something about what that supermarket chains like Woolies and Coles and all that stuff can actually do a lot more in terms of stepping in. And one person actually said she got accused of stealing when she didn't, and then the manager actually forced her to take out everything from her bag. And so she felt humiliated after that, you know, because the person said, oh, Chinese people steal all these things. And so her bag got searched by the manager. So I think these are a lot of problems that are happening, you know, with incidents that happen in the supermarket. I might pass it to Melina. You might have a bit more on the bystander part.
Yeah, so even on the first part, we haven't really had any contact from supermarkets in relation to this, but I suppose the CCTV footage could be used later on if there was an incident and that was needed to be verified for evidence. So that's something that should be explored, I suppose, further in terms of reporting. But in terms of bystander training, I have seen bystander training in terms of for Islamophobia, but not specifically for generalist kind of anti-racism campaign. So that's something that we have recommended should be taken up by organizations. But I also saw on the chat that there is the University of New South Wales, is it, that is offering developing that, and there's others that might be in train. I think people have started responding and have started developing those tools. We've had chats with the Victorian Multicultural Commission, the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission about this as well, and the Australian Human Rights Commission. So hopefully there should be more in the coming times, and that's something that we are pushing for. We haven't come across a general one that's available for anyone to kind of use wherever they want to in any setting. So
I did want to put one more thing. I do believe that I think Democracy in Colour, I think they have or are providing some type of bystander training, but I think it's for various councils and things like that. So maybe you know, for those who may be interested, also kind of check their website as well. But yeah, there always needs to be more with that, just like what Melina mentioned.
But also there's information sessions that are going to be run by the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission that will be specifically for people, for community leaders, to train them in how to educate their own community or possibly assist them as well. So they are currently being developed, and we will be part of that as well. So we will keep people updated, and if there is a possibility for people to attend, we will post it on our website, on our Facebook page.
Okay. Our next question is from Katrina Irawati Graham, and the question is, in cases with police intervention, who gets to decide if racial vilification is going to be included in the changes?
Melina, I think you might be good to answer to that.
Yeah, well, it's the police that decides that in that instance whether there is vilification or not, or if you feel that you haven't got the right response for vilification. There is in Victoria, I'm aware of Victoria, there is anti-vilification laws, and you can approach the court for that. You can file a petition in the court. The issues with the anti-vilification laws is that the bar is set very high in terms of proving what you need to prove that it was vilification. It is really difficult to do that. And secondly, the issue also is about vilification being defined in terms of incitement of a third party, and not about the actual person who's you know, who is the one who is the perpetrator. So that creates an issue in terms of, you know, who are these third, you know, other people who are being incited to act in a particular manner. It's not directed towards people who are actually doing it. So that has been an issue, and that's something that the agencies are working on as well, to strengthen those anti-vilification laws. But at the moment where it stands, it is quite difficult to prove that there is vilification in cases, especially if there's no, you know, physical violence, or it's not very obviously evident what is that it's a racial attack.
Because the second part of this question, Molina, is to say that the victim wanted to do this, but then the police said it was not racially motivated. So I guess the victims get confused in circumstances like this.
Yeah, and that's where I think the education part comes in kind of in working with the communities to understand what is racial discrimination as well. That it can be a joke, it can be racial profiling, it can be stereotyping as well, and that's also racial abuse. It is about education, and plus then it is about, as we spoke, as I mentioned before in the recommendations, is about the police also being able to respond to that better, be trained to respond to those and understand what racism is as well. I'm sure many of them do, but perhaps there may be an opportunity to do a bit more of that training within the police force and agencies.
Okay. All right, now the next question is from John Wong. And the question is, what are the panel's thoughts on some parts of the media using the images of East Asians wearing face masks in a coronavirus related article?
Osmond, you want to start first and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of goes back to those points around unconscious bias. So the sheer fact that these images of people of East Asian appearance are used whenever there's a discussion about COVID-19 sort of reinforces this idea that it is a disease that is primarily carried by people of East Asian appearance, and that, I guess, that is a concern I think that's being raised by a number of groups. But I think, unfortunately, it hasn't necessarily led to significant change.
Yeah. Erin?
I think just following on what Osmond said, and I think a lot of this is also to do as to whether the accountability that the media has, and I guess, like one of our recommendations suggested, is to look at places like Human Rights Commission or some of those state regulatory bodies to work with the Press Council, in terms of having more guidelines of accountability, particularly for the media. Now, that does not mean that we are hindering free speech or freedom of expression, but it means that, in a world where we do have free speech, there still needs to be responsibilities and there still needs to be some type of accountability. And when you put images, random images, like I remember only maybe 2 months ago, there was an article about hoarding toilet paper in general. And then there was a picture of Asian customers walking out of a Costco with their trolleys just full of just stuff that people buy in Costco, because you buy things in bulk when you go to Costco. So it's these type of images that really push that negative stereotype and reinforces the idea that anything to do with COVID-19 is about being Chinese or is about being Asian. And as our survey actually shows, yes, where the majority were people of Chinese descent, but the range of those being subjected to COVID-19 racism range from not just Chinese background, but people of Vietnamese background, people of Korean background, people of Filipino background, but also people of South Asian backgrounds. So I remember one story where somebody, he said that he was, South Asian background, and I think it happened in Perth by memory, and he was called a disgusting Punjabi who eats bats and dogs. So you can see this range of, it does not just stop and anybody who just looks East Asian or looks Chinese. So what is depicted in the media is extremely important, and it really influences what people normalize. And at the moment, this anti-Asian hate or racism is being normalized, and the media has a huge role to play in that.
And I think the politics has a great part in play in that as well. It's about the political narrative or rhetoric going around as well, which normalizes that, and that's what the media picks up on, because it gives them legitimacy and it gives everyone legitimacy after that. So it needs to change at the top, the messaging right at the top, where what are our political leaders saying about that? Not necessarily ours, but you can see what's happening in the US and in other parts of the world where this is called a Chinese virus. I've seen that on social media all the time. It's just labeled now a Chinese virus. It was, I think, 2 days ago, there was a sign outside a pub in Sydney, which I think it was labeled it the Chinese virus as well. And then I had a hipster photo of a Melbourne. Victorians are not allowed either, and I have a photo of a hipster kind of. So that's like that's profiling, and that's how people kind of perceive that's the imaging.
Okay. The next question I think is quite interesting. This is something to do with the Australian identity, and it's from Dinas. And Dina said she was at the faith-run state consultation yesterday when the Australian identity was questioned. So comments, we need to look at this issue from an intersectionality of many criteria, such as racial backgrounds, gender, age, education, socioeconomic, altogether begs the question. So comments from the panel regarding the Australian identity.
Who wants to start?
I guess that's a difficult one because it is a dual identity, as we say, that for people living here of a CAD background, any multicultural background, you can't say, it's very difficult to kind of say what your identity is. It gets merged. Those identities get merged from where you come from, your place of origin, and where you kind of live. And it's different for also people who are born in Australia, and for people who do come from overseas and have to later kind of be part of Australia. Their sense of identity may be very different from the sense of identity of someone who's born here, and the issues that arise and how they face racism or how they perceive racist comments may be very different as well. So I think the identity issue is also about yourself being comfortable with who you are, and it's not an easy one. I would say it's something that we all ourselves have to come to terms with, you know, in how we kind of create a life for ourselves here. Erin, you might be.
Yeah, I think the concept of intersectionality is still a concept that a lot of people still don't fully understand, because, for example, you know, if you're Asian background, if you identify as LGBTIQ, you will face different types of racism that somebody who is just, you know, non-LGBTIQ and is Asian won't face, you know. And I think it's about us being able to understand what intersectionality actually means. And I think this concept of intersectionality, particularly in Australia, is still something that's not fully understood. I know that in the US, there's a lot more discussions around intersectionality, but it does need to be understood. A good example is, you know, as a female myself, of course, I believe in, you know, advancing the rights of women, you know, women having equal pay and things like that. But even within that, you know, women's rights type movement, there is a whole lot of racism and discrimination against women of different cultural backgrounds, women of Indigenous and Torres Strait backgrounds, women who may identify as, you know, something else, LGBTIQ or whatever. So unless we can really understand what intersectionality means, it's very difficult for people to kind of maneuver around it when they talk about different forms of discrimination.
Okay.
I'll just make, Thompson, I just want to make one quick comment. I guess the way I see it is part of the challenge is that we talk about identity as if it's singular and fixed, and really identity is not. Identity is, you know, it's fluid. We all have multiple identities, that some may be more dominant than others at particular times. And I think until we really understand that, I think we will struggle with these issues.
Thank you, Osmond. I'll put forward the final two questions, and this is a very important question because this is in relation to the next step. Now, the first question is from Anthony. The question is Asian Australian Alliance making a Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee on racism in the Australian diaspora? Marking, sorry, not making. And then the second question is from Susanna Ung. And the question is, what's the next step? How can we collaborate to implement actions? What can we do to challenge systemic racism and to promote sustained change?
To answer the first question, yes, we will be submitting, I guess, either our report or even adapting part of the report to fit that submission. But I think it's important that the more of us who make a submission, the more our voices and the more our things will be read and considered, particularly in a Senate submission such as that. On to the second part, I think it is important that we are more unified. But also, it's not just about that. I think it's also about, if we're trying to advance the cause of racism against Asians, we also need to look at how can we support the other groups who are facing the same situation, but at different extremities. So, stuff like Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, those things are also very important for, different, and I'll use the term BIPOC because I think that's more inclusive, groups to, kind of support and I guess, be in solidarity. I think that word solidarity is extremely important. But I think it's also about how do we communicate and how do we engage with each other. And I've seen a lot of great stuff happening, I think, particularly now, particularly over online, with local councils, having, anti-racism working groups and inviting different people to talk, but also ensuring that there are trainings happening for their staff, who do go out there and work, with the people, in that locality. But it's also just for us just to be aware of ourselves and to check ourselves as well. Are we the ones also perpetuating that racism onto somebody else or that discrimination? And if so, how can we work together to kind of combat that? So I think it's a combination of a lot of different things, but I think these next steps and these future steps are extremely important to consider. And we all just need to really think about what we can do and what bit we can add, I guess, to this cause.
And I think we welcome any collaborations that may arise in the future. Anyone who wants to collaborate with us, please feel free to contact us. We have been working quite closely with various agencies in all states, as well as the Human Rights Commission, the police, the universities, the student groups. So the more we can kind of collaborate, the louder our voices, more likely we will be heard and more likely we'll get a solution.
Yeah, and I just want to make one more point, and I just want to acknowledge, I've been reading the chat, and I totally agree with some of the points that, particularly what Jenny Leong has mentioned in terms of police culture needing to change. And I think that's something that, and that's why I guess part of our recommendations is looking at, relevant training, particularly to change police culture. Now, this is not saying all police are bad and police and all that, but there does exist a culture where there is still a lot of misunderstandings, but also a lot of non-sensitive type actions that police have done. And we don't just see this in Australia, but we see this in the US and in other countries as well. So I do want to acknowledge that that was a really good point made by Jenny.
Osmond?
I think everything I wanted to say has been said by everyone else.
Okay, thank you.
I can see a lot of chat happening around collaboration about what different groups are doing. So I think it'll be great if we can kind of all get together in some manner and be able to work together.
Thank you, Molina. And any final thoughts from the panelists before we wrap up?
I think one thing that has, may have dawned, hopefully, with the community kind of seeing the amount of racism that happened. And one thing we need to remember that this racism does not just impact on Asians in Australia, but it's a cycle. So where, Asians may be the target, later on it would be, Islamophobia will happen again. Right now we can see, stuff like, Indigenous, who, facing abuse, you know, and racism and discrimination, those particularly who are or were incarcerated, or how they've been treated when they're being arrested. And these things all need to look at, and we all need to be aware of all these things as well, you know, where we need to be aware of our own issues, but we also need to kind of broaden our minds, and as well as keep in mind the struggles, you know, of other groups. And I did want to note that, for example, you know, one group that, you know, we can look at in terms of them being, you know, struggling since the 1700s, are the Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander communities, who have been, you know, having, you know, struggling against racism since the 1700s. But also keep in mind, Asian racism in Australia has not just started. It has been there since the 1800s, since the first Chinese came for the gold rush, since the first Punjabis or Sikhs came, you know, to Australia to, you know, for their pineapple farms, you know, particularly in northern New South Wales and in Queensland. So it has always been there. It's just transformed and morphed into something else. And COVID-19 is just a symptom of a bigger problem. It's not the cause of racism against Asians. It's a symptom of a bigger problem.
Yeah, it's just a crusade. I think it's a long crusade. It's not going to end with this, and we also actually have our survey open for later as well, because we want to compare the findings from whether during COVID and later, whether anything has changed because of that. We don't expect it to change that much, except that there might be incidents happening in a different manner, or people may not be called, you know, the coronavirus anymore, but there will still be they still be asked to go back to the country where they come from. So you'll still see that, but we want to compare that in the future, for the future. And as I said, the South Asian racism against South Asian campaign is another one that we are looking to sort of start on as well, to address that issue. So yes, this is something that is ongoing. It's a long battle, and hopefully we can continue with this good work by everyone here.
So once again, thank you so much for the contributions from all our panelists, from Erin, from Molina, and from Osmond. Also to the team who has been working hard to prepare the report, Peter Chung as well, who has played a part in doing the editing for the report. And also, I would like to acknowledge the admin who assisted us with some of the questions and comments today, Adri, and also Cindy. Thank you so much. But once again, thanks to all of you who has joined us and tuning to the launch of the preliminary results from the COVID-19 racism report.
And can I just say one more quick thing? Yeah. I'll just quickly share my screen so people know, if you, those who want to actually get a copy of the report, you can actually download it from our website. So let me just quickly show you where that is. So you're seeing all my different things. So I'll just share this screen. So don't mind my Facebook, okay? So on our AsianAustralianAlliance.net page, if you go to the our COVID-19 incident report, the first tab, if you click on that, you can actually download it. So you can either click on the link or you can download a PDF. Okay, so that's all. Back to you, Thompson.
Thanks, Erin.
Yeah.
So to the end, once again, thanks for joining in, and stay safe and goodbye. That's all we have for today. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.